When I was a child, my stepmother sent me away after having her own children. Now, years later, she's asking for my help to raise them. Ha! Funny how things work out. My name is Aiden. I'm 24 years old, and this story goes back to when I was 12, a time that feels like it belongs to a different life entirely. My mom passed away when I was young, and for several years it was just me and Dad. Then he met Lauren. He was outgoing and full of life, and initially she was outgoing and full of life, and initially I found her refreshing. I was shy, but Lauren had a way of making everyone feel included, and for a while things seemed good. Dad was happy, and seeing him happy made me happy too. Lauren even tried to involve me in family activities like dinners and outings. At 12, you don't notice the subtle shifts, so I didn't realize how things began to change when she got pregnant. By the time I turned 13, I was excited at the thought of having siblings. I pictured us growing up together, forming a bond and always being there for each other. But when Lauren gave birth to twins, Lily and Mason, everything turned upside down. At 14, I started to realize I was no longer a priority. Lauren, who used to include me in everything, now poured all her energy into the twins. Suddenly, it felt like I didn't matter. Dad, busy juggling work and the demands of 2 infants, didn't notice what was happening, but I did. Dinners were no longer about us as a family. They became focused entirely on Lily's first smile or Mason's newest sounds. Anytime I tried to talk about my grades or a project I was proud of, my comments were brushed off or outright ignored. The hardest moment came when I was 16. Lauren and Dad sat me down and told me they thought it would be best if I moved in with my Aunt Sarah, who lived 2 hours away. They framed it as an opportunity, a fresh start that would benefit me. Lauren even made it sound like she was doing me a favor. Dad stayed silent, just nodding. I tried to believe them, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was in their way. Living with Aunt Sarah felt strange at first. She was kind, but she had her own life. A single woman who wasn't prepared to take in a teenage boy who had been cast aside by his own family. I spent most of my time alone, sitting in my room and wondering what I had done to deserve this. I called Dad a few times, but he was always too busy. With Lauren, the twins, or work. Our calls grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. No one visited me, and I never went back to visit them. By the time I graduated high school, I had worked a few jobs and saved up enough money to move out on my own at 19. I decided I wouldn't rely on anyone else ever again. I was determined to build a life of my own, far away from them. They didn't call, and I didn't either. Eventually, I stopped thinking about them entirely, until a few weeks ago when a message appeared on my phone. The number wasn't familiar, but I immediately knew it was Lauren. I nearly deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. Aiden, we need to talk. Your father isn't doing well, and things at home are difficult. The twins are teenagers now, and we could really use your help around the house. I read the message several times, disbelief turning into anger. After years of silence, now they needed me? Part of me wanted to reply with a sarcastic, "Oh, so now I matter." But another part of me, one I hated admitting to, was curious. Why now? Why me? And maybe, deep down, I missed Dad. After days of deliberation, I agreed to meet with him. When I arrived at the house, memories I hadn't thought about in years came flooding back. It looked the same, though somehow smaller. Dad greeted me at the door, and I barely recognized him. He looked frail, older, with gray hair and deep wrinkles. Despite my resentment, seeing him like that hurt. He was still my dad. Lauren appeared shortly after, wearing a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked almost the same as I remembered, poised and polished, with a hint of something calculating in her expression. She led me to the kitchen where we sat awkwardly. The twins weren't around, and I wondered if they even knew who I was or cared. After some small talk, Lauren got to the point. "Your father's health hasn't been great lately," she began, her tone overly measured. "And with Mason and Lily being teenagers, things have been chaotic. It's been a lot for me to handle on my own." I almost laughed at the irony. Years ago, she had no problem sending me away, and now she wanted help? "Why now?" I asked bluntly. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" Lauren shifted uncomfortably, but didn't miss a beat. "Eden, we thought giving you space was best. At your age, a change of scenery seemed like it could be good for you." "A change of scenery," I repeated, trying to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. She sighed. "Look, maybe we made mistakes, but your father really needs you now. The kids could use a role model, and I hear you're doing well for yourself." Her words struck a nerve. I glanced at Dad, who sat silently, looking pale and worn. I wanted to ask him why he had let all of this happen, why he had chosen her over me, but seeing him like that, I couldn't bring myself to say it. Just as I was trying to figure out what to do, Mason walked in. At 16, he was taller than me, with dark hair and a detached look that felt eerily familiar. He muttered a quiet, "Hey," before heading upstairs without another word. Lauren's expression softened as she watched him go, practically glowing with pride. I couldn't help but wonder if she had ever looked at me like that. The silence in the room grew heavier as Lauren picked up where she left off. Lauren's words lingered in my mind. "I think this would be a good way for us to reconnect," she had said, with a tone that felt carefully rehearsed. "For the family." I glanced at Dad, who finally looked up to meet my eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Aiden, just give it a try." Against my better judgment, I nodded, though something about the situation felt off. I agreed to stay for a few days, hoping to clear my head and make sense of the tangled mess I'd found myself in. That inspired me. Lauren permeated my entire body, and my mind seemed oddly determined to keep things flexible. I'd rented a small apartment in a nearby town, giving myself an easy way out if things got too overwhelming. For now, though, I was there. Lauren seemed oddly determined to keep me occupied, assigning me one chore after another. I maintained a polite demeanor, mainly for Dad's sake, but the unspoken tension between Lauren and I was impossible to ignore. She alternated between awkward small talk and avoiding meaningful conversations entirely. It felt like we were participants in some strange, unspoken charade. The next day, I found myself alone with Mason, someone I had barely exchanged a handful of words with. He was polite enough, but distant, with a guarded demeanor that I understood. To him, I was little more than a stranger. We'd crossed paths only a few times as kids, and those memories were hazy at best. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that he was studying me, quietly observing my every move. That afternoon, while I worked on repairing a broken fence in the backyard, Mason wandered over. Leaning against a nearby post, he silently watched me for a while. He seemed lost in thought, staring into the distance. Finally, he spoke. "So, what made you decide to come back?" I shrugged, wiping the sweat off my forehead. "I guess I was curious," I replied honestly. "Your mom didn't exactly give me much of a choice with how she phrased things." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "She's good at that, isn't she?" I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to ensure we were alone. She has a way of convincing people to do what she wants. She makes it sound like it's for their benefit, but it's really for her." His candidness caught me off guard. I had assumed Mason would be fiercely loyal to his mother, considering how close they seemed. Yet here he was, warning me not to trust her. Had he noticed more than I realized? Before I could respond, Mason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, Aiden, you don't know the half of it. She didn't bring you back just for Dad. There's more to it than that. Just be careful." His words unsettled me, but they also felt genuine. Despite the emotional distance between us, I trusted him. Perhaps it was because we both seemed to exist on the outskirts of this family, looking in from the outside. It was strange to feel a connection with someone I barely knew, yet shared so much with. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to the household dynamics. It didn't take long to notice how controlling Lauren was, particularly when it came to Dad's interactions with me. She always found subtle ways to intervene, steering our conversations back to topics revolving around her or the family's needs. If Dad and I managed to get a moment alone, she would inevitably interrupt, sometimes with a chore that needed doing, other times with some minor issue involving the twins. Then there was Lily. At 16, she epitomized the rebellious teenager. Every interaction with her ended in an eye roll or an exasperated sigh. Unlike Mason, who seemed at least somewhat curious about me, Lily clearly resented my presence. She barely acknowledged me, preferring to retreat to her room or bury herself in her phone. I eventually gave up trying to engage her. It was clear I wasn't welcome in her world. On the third evening, I overheard Lauren and Dad talking in the kitchen after dinner. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but their voices carried, and the tension in their words caught my attention. "I'm telling you, we need his help," Lauren said, her tone laced with frustration. "You know we can't handle everything on our own. And the business, well, it's not what it used to be." Dad's response was softer, tired. "But it's not fair to ask Aiden for financial help, Lauren. He's just starting out himself, and after everything—" Lauren scoffed. "Oh, come on. He's not some helpless victim. He's an adult now. He can contribute like the rest of us." My stomach churned. Financial help? Was that the real reason they'd reached out to me? Had they brought me back to guilt me into supporting them? I retreated to my room, my mind racing with anger and hurt. I'd put myself in this awkward, painful situation only to discover they wanted me to bankroll their lives. The next morning, I sought out Dad, finding him alone in the living room with a cup of coffee. He sat by the window, looking worn and weary, his expression lined with something that resembled regret. I took a deep breath and sat beside him. "Dad," I began carefully, "can we talk about why you wanted me here?" He glanced at me, his expression cautious. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" "I overheard you and Lauren talking last night," I admitted, "about finances and me helping out. I need to know, am I here because you need help, or is there something else going on?" Dad looked away, gripping his coffee mug tightly. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumped. "Aiden, I didn't want to ask you for anything. I just wanted to see you again, to have you back in our lives. I know, things didn't go the way they should have." His words hit me hard. I could see how much he was struggling, but I also sensed he wasn't telling me everything. "So, the financial stuff, that's Lauren's idea?" I pressed gently. He nodded, looking ashamed. She thinks you're doing well, and that maybe you'd be willing to help us out. I told her it wasn't fair to ask you, but she's worried, Aiden. Things haven't been easy, especially with the business struggling." I took a deep breath, a storm of anger and pity churning inside me. Dad seemed ensnared in Lauren's influence, unable to escape her grasp. He wanted to reconnect with me, but Lauren had twisted it into something self-serving, and now I was stuck in the middle of their tangled mess. As I mulled over my options, Mason appeared at the doorway, silently observing. His small nod of understanding told me he had overheard at least part of our conversation, though he said nothing and soon disappeared. Later that night, Mason approached me again. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against my doorway. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a faint smile, "just trying to make sense of everything." He nodded, his expression serious. "If you're thinking about helping them, just be careful. Don't take everything Mom says at face value. She can be convincing, but she doesn't always tell the whole story." His words lingered long after he left. I felt trapped, caught between lingering resentments and fresh responsibilities. Trust felt like a distant concept, and with every passing day, Lauren's true motives became clearer. This wasn't about family. It was about control, manipulation. If I didn't find a way out of her schemes, I'd be pulled right back into her web. After my talk with Mason, an uneasy feeling began to take root. Lauren's efforts to draw me in became more overt, almost desperate. Every time I tried to have a private conversation with Dad, she found a reason to interrupt, as if she were deliberately keeping us apart. One night, after another strained family dinner, I stepped outside to clear my mind. The cold air was sharp but refreshing, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I didn't wander far, just to the end of the block and back. When I returned, something caught my attention. The living room lights were still on, and through the window I could see Lauren and Dad engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. Curious, I crept closer, straining to hear their words. I knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, but I was tired of being left in the dark. Inheritance. We've talked about this before, Robert, Lauren was saying, her tone sharp and insistent. Dad looked uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on his hands. I told you, Lauren, I'm not cutting him out. Aiden is still my son no matter what's happened. He deserves something. Lauren's face contorted with frustration. Are you serious after everything? He left Robert. He didn't want anything to do with us for years, and now you're ready to just hand over what should go to Mason and Lily? Dad sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's not about handing anything over. It's about doing what's right. I can't just erase him because it's easier for you. My chest tightened as I pieced together the conversation. Lauren had been pushing to exclude me from any inheritance, wanting her biological children to benefit exclusively. Despite his flaws, Dad was standing firm, refusing to let her erase me entirely. But how long could he resist her relentless pressure? I was limitless, potentially. Nothing without seeing another one. Eventually, their conversation fizzled out, and Lauren stormed off to bed, leaving Dad alone in the dim light of the living room. I retreated to my room, emotions swirling. Anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. I wanted to confront them right then and demand the truth, but the chaos was too overwhelming. Instead, I resolved to come up with a plan. The next morning, Mason and I managed to find a few minutes alone in the garage. I told him what I'd overheard, watching as his eyes widened in a mix of shock and frustration. I knew she was trying to control things, he said, clenching his fists, but this? Cutting you out entirely? That's beyond messed up. His support was comforting, but I couldn't help questioning his loyalties. He was still her son, after all. Yet his anger seemed genuine, as though he were seeing Lauren's manipulative nature for the first time. I don't know what to do, I admitted. Part of me wants to just walk away and let them deal with their own mess. But then there's Dad. He's not perfect, but he's still my father. I can see he wants to make things right, even if he's too weak to stand up to her. Mason nodded thoughtfully. You need to talk to him one-on-one. Get him out of the house, away from her. Maybe then you'll get some real answers without her breathing down his neck. It was a solid plan, and I decided to go for it. That afternoon, I suggested to Dad that we take a drive together. He hesitated, likely anticipating Lauren's reaction, but I caught a glimmer of relief in his eyes. We ended up at a small park on the outskirts of town, sitting on a bench overlooking a frozen lake. Away from the house, Dad seemed more at ease, though the weight of his troubles was still evident. Dad, I began, keeping my tone calm, I need to know what's really going on. Lauren's been vague, but I get the feeling there's more to this than just needing help around the house. He sighed, his shoulders slumping as though shedding a heavy burden. Aiden, I owe you an apology. I should have fought harder to keep you with us. I was weak. I let Lauren convince me that sending you to live with Sarah was best, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. His words hit hard. For years I'd questioned whether he even cared about the decision to send me away. Hearing him admit his regret felt like long overdue closure, even if it came too late. "So, why bring me back now?" I asked gently. "What's really going on with the inheritance? Why is Lauren so determined to cut me out?" He hesitated, staring down at his hands. "It's true that our finances aren't great. The business is barely staying afloat, and I'm not sure how much longer we can hold on. Lauren, she thinks the only way to secure a future for Lily and Mason is to control every penny we have. But I won't just erase you, Aiden. You're still my son." I nodded, my anger softening into pity. Lauren had manipulated him so thoroughly that he was willing to compromise his own principles to appease her. I realized then that he was just as much a victim of her control as I was. After that conversation, I felt a renewed determination to protect my place in the family. It was time to stand up to Lauren and take back what was mine. That night, after Dad had gone to bed, I found Mason in the hallway. "I need your help," I whispered. "If we're going to figure this out, I need someone on the inside. Can I trust you?" He looked conflicted for a moment, then nodded resolutely. "You can trust me, Aiden. Mom's my mother, but I can't stand by and let her do this to you. It's not right." Together, we began to form a plan. Mason had taken it upon himself to watch Lauren closely, keeping tabs on her behavior and activities. He'd already noticed her stepping out for late-night phone calls and running unexplained errands, all with a sense of secrecy. It was clear she was hiding something, and whatever it was, she didn't want anyone to find out. The following evening, Mason slipped into my room, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he whispered, holding up his phone. "I found emails on Mom's laptop. She's been talking to a lawyer about changing Dad's will. She's trying to cut you out completely so that everything goes to Lily and me." This was a chill ran down my spine. I had known Lauren was manipulative, but this was a new low. She wasn't just trying to exclude me. She was rewriting the family's history to erase me entirely. Worst of all, she was exploiting Dad's failing health to push her plan forward. "We can't let her do this," I said, my voice barely audible. "I need to show Dad what she's doing. He has to know." Mason nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll back you up, Aiden. Whatever you need, I'm here." The next morning, I decided to confront Lauren directly. I found her in the kitchen, sipping coffee with an air of smugness, as if she had already won. "We need to talk," I said, stepping into the room with purpose. She glanced up, her face shifting from mild surprise to irritation. "Oh, about what?" "About your plans to rewrite Dad's will," I said, my tone firm as I watched her reaction closely. For a brief moment, panic flashed across her face, but she quickly replaced it with a tight, dismissive smile. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the act, Lauren," I snapped. "Mason found your emails. I know you're trying to push me out so that everything goes to Lily and Mason, but it's not going to happen. My business is going to continue. You'll not be able to disrupt it." Her eyes narrowed and her mask slipped. "You don't know anything, Aiden. You left this family. You abandoned us. Now you think you can just waltz back in and take what you don't deserve?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I didn't abandon anyone. You pushed me out because you couldn't handle having a stepson. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Dad deserves to know the truth." Her face twisted in fury, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But instead she stepped back, her expression shifting to one of icy calculation. "Fine," she said coldly. "Go ahead. Tell him. But remember this, Aiden. You may be his son, but you're still an outsider here. When it comes down to it, he'll choose me and the twins over you, just like he always has." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see the impact. This time I wasn't going to back down. After that confrontation, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Lauren kept her distance, but every glance she shot my way was laced with contempt. It was clear she wasn't giving up her plans, and I knew I needed to act fast. Mason was the only ally I had in this twisted family drama, and over the next few days we worked together to uncover more of her schemes. Mason continued sneaking onto Lauren's laptop whenever she wasn't around, looking for anything we could use against her. One night he came into my room, his face serious. "I think I found something big," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. I leaned in, my heart pounding. "What is it?" He handed me his phone, showing a series of emails from Lauren's account. The most recent one was to a lawyer, but this time it wasn't just about the will. She was asking about liquidating assets and transferring money to an offshore account. "What if she need an offshore account?" I asked, my mind racing. "And why keep it a secret?" Mason shook his head, his expression troubled. "I don't know, but it can't be good." We continued digging through the emails, piecing together a story that made my stomach turn. Lauren had been systematically draining money from Dad's business accounts, quietly moving it into separate accounts under her name. Worse, she had already started withdrawing money from Dad's personal savings. This wasn't a recent development. She had been planning this for years, siphoning small amounts so that Dad wouldn't notice. "She's bleeding him dry," I muttered, my voice trailing off as the enormity of her betrayal sank in. "She's probably waiting for him to, pass," Mason finished grimly. "Once he's gone, she'll have control of everything." The pieces began to fall into place. Lauren didn't just want me out of the picture because of an inheritance. She wanted complete control over the house, the money, everything. And if things didn't go according to plan, she had an escape route lined up, leaving nothing behind. Mason's face was pale as he looked at me. "We have to tell Dad. He needs to know." I nodded, though the thought of breaking this to Dad made my chest tighten. He was already frail, and I had no idea how he'd handled such a devastating betrayal. But if we didn't tell him, Lauren would take everything he had worked for and walk away without consequences. The next morning, I woke early, determined to get to Dad before Lauren could interfere. I found him in his study, hunched over a stack of old papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. "Dad," I said softly, sitting across from him. "There's something you need to know. It's about Lauren." He looked up, startled, his tired eyes scanning my face. "What about her?" I hesitated, then handed him Mason's phone, the incriminating emails already pulled up. "She's been taking money from you, business accounts, personal savings, all of it. She's hiding it in separate accounts, and now she's looking into offshore accounts. She's planning something, Dad, and I think she's trying to cut me out entirely so she can take full control if something happens to you." Dad stared at the screen, his expression shifting from confusion to devastation. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the emails, his face draining of color as if he had aged a decade in mere moments. I can't believe it," he whispered. His whisper widened in volume. "She wouldn't do this. She's my wife." A pang of sympathy hit me, but I pressed forward. "Dad, I know this is hard, but it's all there. She's been stealing from you, and now she's planning to leave. If we don't act, she's going to take everything." He buried his face in his hands, and for a moment I thought he might completely fall apart. Then he took a deep breath, raising his head with newfound determination in his eyes. "You're right, Aiden. We can't let her get away with this." For the first time since I'd returned, I felt a spark of hope. Dad was ready to stand up to her and fight for what was left of our family. But as we discussed our next steps, the door flew open and there was Lauren, her face twisted in rage. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice quivering. "What lies has you been feeding you, Robert?" Dad turned to her, anger and sadness mingling in his expression. "No more lies, Lauren. I know everything. I know about the money you've been taking, the offshore accounts. I trusted you, and you betrayed me." She laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "Please, you've been a useless shell of a man for years, Robert. You can't even take care of yourself, let alone this family. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat." Dad's hands clenched into fists, trembling as he replied. "No, Lauren. You did it for yourself. You wanted control. You wanted it all." Her glare shifted to me, her eyes venomous. "And what about you, Aiden? You think you're some kind of hero now? You left us. You abandoned this family. Now you think you can just stroll back in and play savior?" I stood firm, refusing to let her words pierce me. "I left because you pushed me out, Lauren. You didn't want me here, but now I'm back, and I'm not going to let you take advantage of Dad anymore." For a second, it looked like she might actually lunge at me. Instead, she took a step back, her face cold and calculating. "Fine," she said icily. "You want to play family? Go ahead. But don't think for a second you can get rid of me that easily. I'll fight for everything I've built, and you won't stand a chance." With that, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Dad and I sat in silence, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on us. "What now?" I finally asked. Dad sighed, looking exhausted but resolute. "We get a lawyer, we protect what we can, and we make sure she doesn't take another penny." Over the next several days, Dad and I worked closely with an attorney, gathering as much evidence as we could of Lauren's deceit. Mason, though clearly conflicted, pitched in wherever he could, digging up documents and handing over the incriminating emails. Lily, on the other hand, was harder to reach. She idolized her mother and was completely unaware of the truth. Every attempt I made to talk to her was met with resistance. She would shut down, refusing to even hear me out. Lauren wasn't giving up without a fight. One evening, after returning from a meeting with Dad's lawyer, I found her waiting for me in the living room. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes were as cold as ice. "We could have worked something out, Aiden," she said in a dangerously soft voice. "But you had to come back and stir up trouble. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I crossed my arms, standing firm. "I'm not afraid of you, Lauren. You don't scare me." A sinister smile spread across her face. "You should be. You think you've won? You haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I have connections, Aiden. People who owe me favors. Keep pushing, and I'll make sure you regret it." Her veiled threat sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to show fear. I walked away, determined to stay strong. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the realization of just how dangerous she had become. Desperation had turned her into a true threat, and I knew the fight ahead would be brutal. The days that followed felt like a tense standoff. Lauren kept her distance, but every glance she sent my way was loaded with unspoken threats. Dad, Mason, and I worked tirelessly with the lawyer, building a solid case to protect Dad's assets. But I knew Lauren wouldn't simply sit by and watch her schemes unravel. One evening, Dad pulled me aside. He looked weary but determined. "Aiden," he said quietly, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I stepped back from the business completely. I want to make sure you and Mason are taken care of, and I don't want Lauren to have any control over it." The gravity of his words hit me hard. He was willing to walk away from everything he'd built just to protect us. It was bittersweet. On one hand, it felt like he was finally choosing me over Lauren. On the other, I could see how much it hurt him to let go. That week, we finalized the legal steps to lock Lauren out of Dad's accounts and the family business. Her reaction was explosive. She screamed, accused Dad of betrayal, and hurled insults at me. But when she realized she'd lost, her fire burned out, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. She packed a bag and left that night, vanishing into the shadows she had once wielded so effectively. In the quiet that followed, our family began to heal. Lily eventually softened, opening up as she started to see the truth. Mason and I grew closer, forging a bond I never thought possible. Dad and I spent more time together, finally rebuilding the relationship we'd lost so many years ago. For the first time in what felt like forever, I truly felt like I belonged. As for Lauren, I never heard from her again.